Would you like to be married to you? The prison of resentment. The biggest disruptor of intimacy is low-level chronic anger and irritation. My resentment toward Bela, for his impatience and temper, for the ways he remained stuck in the past, for the disappointment that sometimes showed in his face when he looked at our son, festered for so many years that I thought the only way to be free was to divorce him. It was only after we'd split and completely disrupted our children's lives, not to mention our own, that I realized my disappointment and anger had little to do with Bela and everything to do with me, with my own unfinished emotional business and unresolved grief. The suffocation I felt in our marriage wasn't Bela's fault. It was the price of all the years I'd spent disowning my feelings. Sorrow for my mother, who gave up an independent, cosmopolitan life working for a consulate in Budapest, and gave up a man she loved but was forbidden to marry because he wasn't Jewish, to do what others expected her to do. Fear of repeating the loneliness of my parents' marriage. Grief over my first love, Eric, who died in Auschwitz, and grief for my parents. I got married and became a mother before I'd come to terms with my losses, and suddenly I was 40, the age my mother had been when she died. It felt like I was running out of time to live how I wanted to live, free. But instead of finding freedom by discovering my own genuine purpose and direction, I decided that freedom meant being away from Bela's yelling, cynicism, irritation, and disappointment, from the things I imagined limited me. When we're angry, it's often because there's a gap between our expectations and reality. We think it's the other person who's trapping and aggravating us, but the real prison is our unrealistic expectations. Often we marry like Romeo and Juliet, without really knowing each other. We fall in love, or with an image of a person to whom we've assigned all the traits and characteristics we crave, or with someone with whom we can repeat the familiar patterns we learned in our families of origin. Or we present a false self, seeking love in a secure relationship by giving up who we really are. Falling in love is a chemical high. It feels amazing, and it's temporary. When the feeling fades, we're left with a lost dream, with a sense of loss over the partner or relationship we never had in the first place. So many salvageable relationships are abandoned in despair. But love isn't what you feel. It's what you do. There's no going back to the early days of a relationship, to the time before you became angry and disappointed and cut off. There's something better, a renaissance, a new beginning. Marina, a dancer and performance artist, was trying to figure out if such a rebirth was possible in her marriage, whether she and her husband could move forward together in a healthy way, or if the way to freedom meant finally letting go of the relationship. We've been fighting every day for 18 years, she told me, twisting her long hair into a loose bun. Sometimes the fights were violent. Her husband didn't hit her, but he acted out, shoved chairs, threw his phone against the wall, overturned the bed she was sitting on. I try to avoid being home, she said, because every conversation turns into him telling me what I did wrong. Afraid to stand up to him, afraid to walk out of the room when he was raging. She tried to maintain her dignity and keep the peace, but she was losing self-respect, feeling more and more disempowered. And she was worried about how the constant fighting was affecting their teenage daughter. She didn't want to continue as things were, yet was unsure how to chart a path forward, unclear about her options. Every choice has a price, something you gain and something you lose. One choice we can always make is to do nothing, to decide not to decide, to keep on going the way we are. At the other extreme, Marina could decide to leave the relationship and file for divorce. You don't have to be stuck, I told her. You don't have to sit there in a bad situation. However, I cautioned, a divorce can be an extreme way of continuing to do nothing. What do you gain from a divorce? It gives you a piece of paper that says you're now free to marry someone else. Divorce doesn't resolve the emotional business of the relationship. It just gives you legal permission to repeat the same pattern with someone else. It doesn't make you free. Whether Marina decided to leave her husband or stay in the marriage, her work was the same. to uncover the needs and expectations she brought to the marriage, and to heal the wounds she had brought with her, that she would keep carrying for the rest of her life until she dealt with them. We examined her expectations first. Did you know about your husband's anger when you married him? I asked. She shook her head vehemently. He wins hearts, she said. An accomplished actor. He knows how to make his audience fall in love with him. Before they were married, she only saw this side of him, the charmer, the philosopher, the romantic. Now the shoes fly. So what keeps you there? I asked. As I said, every behavior satisfies a need. Even an imprisoning and terrifying situation can serve us in some way. Do you need the financial security? Or maybe you need the fighting? I'm scared to be alone. We all carry a fear of abandonment from infancy. But as she described her childhood in Western Europe, it was clear that her fear of abandonment had been compounded by outright neglect. When she was 14, her father said he could no longer stand to live with her mother and left. He never once came back to visit his children. He didn't even call to check in. Marina's mother was too distraught to cope with the needs of her family. So Marina stepped in to fill the role, putting the younger children to bed, staying up late to bake bread and prepare food for the next day. A year later, when the Berlin Wall came down, her mother made her own devastating announcement. She'd met an East German man through a newspaper ad. She was moving to former East Germany to be with him, taking the younger children with her. Marina would stay behind. She'd have to fend for herself. She handed Marina the rental agreement for a room in a house and left the next day. She didn't so much as call for more than a year. The fact that Marina survived at all is a huge testament to her inner strength and resiliency. She stayed in the rental house for a few months until new tenants moved in, including a father who tried to seduce her, coming to her room at night with a glass of wine. She broke her lease, left school, and moved from town to town throughout Western Europe, working multiple jobs, house-sitting for people away on vacation, at one point living on an artist's commune, another time staying at a rehabilitation farm where people in recovery came to take care of horses. She developed a dangerous eating disorder, convinced that she must be a terrible person to have been left by both her parents, thinking that if she could make herself disappear, maybe her parents would finally notice she was missing. When Marina was 16, the owner of the rehab farm, herself an active alcoholic, turned Marina out. She stood on the street with a suitcase in each hand, homeless and alone. In despair, she called her mom and begged for help, but her mother was still steeped in her own struggle and refused. From that moment on, I knew I was completely alone in the world, Marina said. In her early 20s, she moved to Berlin in search of better work opportunities, and through connections began to train with a performance group, living in an old trailer in the backyard of her school. It wasn't an easy life. The trailer was unheated. She froze her way through the fierce Berlin winters, endured rigorous training, but the new life suited her. While dancing, she felt strong and free. She couldn't starve herself and detach from her body anymore. And for the first time, she no longer wanted to. She had discovered passion and purpose, the joy of moving her body, the power of movement and expression. She fell in love with another performer who'd grown up in East Germany during the Cold War. It was difficult for him to communicate his emotions, to show love. Like my parents, I guess, Marina said ruefully. 2 years after they broke up, he died by suicide. Intellectually, she knew his death wasn't her fault, that even if they'd stayed together, she couldn't have saved him, but the loss hit her hard. They found him a week or two after he died, she said. He was completely alone. We all go into relationships carrying messages we learned in childhood. Sometimes it's a literal phrase someone repeated, like when my mother told me, "A bad husband is better than no husband." Sometimes it's something we glean from others' actions or the home environment. "Honey," I told Marina, "I'm hearing that you carry a message inside, that if you love someone, they'll leave you." Tears sprang into her eyes. She wrapped her arms around herself as though the room had suddenly gone cold. When we're imprisoned, It's the damaging messages that stick. But there's another message I hear in your story, I told her. That you're a woman of strength. Once you were that scared, lonely girl standing on the street with your suitcases. Many times you could have died, and you didn't. Now look at you. Out of something you didn't want, you made something good. You're good. Believing at a fundamental level that she wasn't worthy of love, Marina had chosen a partner and patterns of behavior that reinforced this belief. I often see this dynamic in military marriages, when it's only a matter of time before you'll have to deploy or move and start your life anew. It's hard to trust that someone will really stick with you through the distance and disruption. One way to cope with the fear of how much it will hurt to be apart, or the fear that someone will leave us or be unfaithful, is to avoid being close. Marina had married a man who charmed her into feeling safe and adored, only to use their relationship as a punching bag. He was carrying his own pain into the relationship, and his method of coping with his unresolved emotional business, to rage and blame, just reinforced Marina's internalized message that to love is to be hurt and abandoned. Perhaps you're both using the fighting to fight intimacy, I said. So let's look at your pattern. Many couples have a 3-step dance, a cycle of conflict they keep repeating. Step 1 is frustration. It's left to fester, and pretty soon they move on to step 2, fighting. They yell or rage until they're tired and fall into step 3, making up. Never have sex after a fight. It just reinforces the fighting. Making up seems like the end of the conflict, but it's really a continuation of the cycle. The initial frustration hasn't been resolved. You've just set yourselves up for another go-round. I wanted to give Marina some tools to help her stop the dance at step 1. What were the frustration triggers that kept launching them into the same imprisoning dance? You're either contributing to the relationship or you're contaminating it, I said. How do each of you contaminate the marriage? When I want to have a discussion with him, express a feeling, or bring something up, he's afraid of being guilty, that something's his fault. His preferred defense was offense, to turn the tables and attack Marina with blame and criticism. And what's your part in it? I asked. I try to explain myself, or I say stop, and he explodes and starts kicking or throwing or smashing something. I gave her an assignment, a detour to get them off the path they kept choosing. The next time he tells you you're wrong, your answer is, you're right. He can't fight with that. And you're not lying, because everybody makes mistakes. Anybody could improve. Just say, yes, you're right. If we deny an accusation, we're still accepting blame. We're taking responsibility for something that isn't ours. The next time he's angry, ask yourself, whose problem is it? Unless you caused the problem, you're not responsible when he tries to put the monkey on your back. Give the monkey back. Say, sounds like you're in a tough position. Sounds like you're mad about that. When he tries to make his feelings about you, give the feeling back to him. It's his feeling to face, and you hope he'll let go. When you step into the ring, he's looking at you, not at his feeling. Stop rescuing him. When Marina and I spoke a few weeks later, she said the de-escalation tools were working. Their fights had radically diminished. But I have so much resentment against him, she said. This time it wasn't his anger she wanted to talk about, it was her own. In my mind, I make him responsible for everything. So do the opposite, I said. Thank him. She stared at me, eyebrows raised in surprise. You choose your attitude, so thank him, and thank your parents, too. They're helping you become a very good survivor. And just ignore what happened? Leave out what they did? Make peace with it. Many of us didn't have the loving and caring parents we desired and deserved. Maybe they were preoccupied, angry, worried, depressed. Maybe we were born at the wrong time, in a season of friction or loss or financial strain. Maybe our caregivers were dealing with their own trauma, and they weren't always responsive to our needs for attention and affection. Maybe they didn't pick us up and say, we always wanted a child just like you. You're grieving over the parents you never had, I told Marina. and you can grieve over the husband you don't have. Grief helps us face and ultimately release what happened or didn't happen, and it opens up space to see what is and choose where we go from here. Would you like to be married to you? I asked. She gave me a confused look. What do you like about you? She was silent, her brow creased as though taken aback, or maybe she was just searching for the words. She began hesitantly, but her voice became fuller as she spoke. Her eyes brightened, and a flush rose in her cheeks. I like that I care about other people, she said. I like that I have passion, that I love climbing high. I like that I don't give up. Write it down, honey, I said. Carry those words in your purse. Taking an honest inventory is so important. It's easy to reach for critiques of others and ourselves, to focus on wrongs and complaints, but all of us are good. We choose what we focus on. What's good about your husband? I asked. She paused, squinting slightly, as though trying to see into the distance. He cares, she said. Even though he is like he is, I know he cares about me. And he's working hard. I injured my shoulder and he helped me. There are times when he supports me. Are you stronger with him or without him? Only you can decide if a relationship depletes or empowers you. But it's not a question to answer quickly. You can't know the truth about your relationships until you deal with your own wounds, until you bury and leave behind all the things from the past you're still dragging around. My decision to divorce Bela was unkind and unnecessary, but it was useful in one way. It created more silence and space for me to start to face my past and my grief. It didn't liberate me from my emotions and trauma, from flashbacks, from feeling numb, anxious, isolated, and afraid. Only I could do that. Be careful what you do when you're restless, my sister Magda had warned me. You can start to think the wrong things. He's to this, he's to that. I've suffered enough. You end up missing the same things that drove you crazy. And I did miss Bela. The way he danced and wore joy on his sleeve. His relentless humor. How he made me laugh in spite of myself. His steadfast appetite for risk. 2 years after our divorce, we remarried. But we didn't return to the same marriage we'd had before. We weren't resigned to each other. We'd chosen each other anew. And this time, without the distorted lens of resentment and unmet expectations. Your husband is getting your anger, I told Marina. But maybe he's not the one you're really angry with. We cast others in the roles that help us enact the story we've decided to tell. When we tell a new story, when we come home to our wholeness, our relationships might improve. Or we might find that we don't need them anymore, that they don't have a place in the story of freedom. You don't have to figure it out in a hurry. In fact, it's best to stop figuring and trying to understand. It's an answer that will come only by playing more, by living your life as fully as possible, and being who you already are, a person of strength. Keys to free yourself from resentment. Change the dance steps. Many couples have a 3-step dance, a cycle of conflict they keep repeating. It starts with frustration, escalates to fighting, and appears to restore harmony when they make up. Until the initial frustration is resolved, the peace won't last for long. What frustration triggers keep going unresolved in your relationship? How can you change the dance at step 1 before you fall into the old cycle? Decide on one thing to do differently the next time frustration brews, then do it. Take note of how it went and celebrate any change. Take care of your own emotional business. Reflect on a message about love that you may have learned as a child and may be carrying into your relationships. For example, Marina was carrying the message that if you love someone, they leave. What did your childhood teach you about love? Fill in this sentence. If you love someone, would you like to be married to you? What qualities do you think create a comfortable and thriving relationship? Would you like to be married to someone such as you? What strengths do you bring to the table? Make a list. What behaviors might be challenging to live with? Make a list. Are you living in a way that brings out your best self?